Whenever there's incriminating stories about Joe Biden, the practice of the corporate media is simply to ignore it, just to pretend that it doesn't exist. That has happened in so many instances where new reporting has shed light on the corrupt actions, not of Hunter Biden, but of Joe Biden with regard to the international business deals that Hunter had pursued in the name of the Biden family. We've showed you so many times when that has happened, and it's true for other incriminating stories as well. But there are times when the corporate media simply can't ignore it. If Congress is holding hearings on it and then going around on other shows that put them on talking about it, they do have to sometimes talk about these stories. They can't completely ignore them. And when they do, when they're forced to, the reflexive practice is just to lie about these stories, to immediately defend the Democratic Party and defend Joe Biden. And that is the case with the emerging scandal involving Hunter Biden, where the Biden Justice Department gave Hunter Biden such a remarkably generous deal that the minute it was subjected to judicial scrutiny, it instantly crumbled. Both sides, or rather the prosecutors, denied that they were offering to Hunter Biden what Hunter Biden's lawyers, I think credibly, claimed that they had in fact offered him. And then the deals fell apart. And as we know, Merrick Garland appointed a special counsel who just so happened to be the very same prosecutor, David Weiss, who presided over this debacle in the first place. We spent an episode last week exploring all of that. Now, one of the key witnesses who the Republicans were able to get to testify is Devon Archer, who was a longtime business partner and close friend of Hunter Biden, and he was able to say many things, including the fact that Joe Biden was absolutely aware of and had spoken with Devon Archer about the deals in which Hunter Biden was involved, not necessarily on a granular or detailed level, but he was clearly indicating his happiness that those two were working together despite years of denials, vehement, emphatic denials from Joe Biden and his White House that he was even aware of or had ever spoken to Hunter about these business deals, something they're now forced to acknowledge. Now, as you know, the core of the scandal, or at least one prong of the scandal, is that there was a Ukrainian energy company, Burisma, that paid Hunter Biden $80,000 a month in order to sit on its board. Nobody thinks it was because Hunter Biden has any expertise in the energy industry. Even if he did, he knows nothing about Eastern European energy. He was obviously paid for one reason, namely that he was promising access to an influence from his dad, who happened to be the vice president of the United States. Now, obviously, the question is, why does Joe Biden have influence in Ukraine? Ukraine's supposed to be a democratic country, a sovereign country, remember all that? And the answer is because Joe Biden was the person who was running Ukraine, along with Victoria Nuland under the second term of the Obama administration. That was when Victoria Nuland and the State Department had succeeded in removing the democratically elected president from Ukraine, who the United States was getting angry at because they thought he was too close to Moscow, and they replaced him with a puppet government that the United States was able to control, and as a result, Ukraine essentially became like a colony of the United States. Joe Biden was running Ukraine on a granular level to the point that he was even deciding which prosecutors should stay and which prosecutors should go. And we know that Joe Biden intervened in Ukraine and demanded that the anti-corruption prosecutor, Victor Shokin, be fired because Joe Biden boasted about it on video. Exactly what Donald Trump was impeached for in that first impeachment trial, namely threatening to withhold aid from Ukraine unless Ukraine did what he wanted. In the case of Trump, all he wanted was for Ukraine to provide information about what Joe Biden and his son were doing in Ukraine. In the case of Joe Biden, however, he was threatening to withhold loan guarantees unless the Ukrainians fired their anti-corruption prosecutor. And the argument has always been that Joe Biden did nothing corrupt there because the Ukrainian prosecutor that he wanted fired was not actually prosecuting or pursuing Burisma, the company paying his son, but was failing to prosecute Burisma. And therefore, when Joe Biden demanded the firing of this prosecutor, it wasn't actually a favor for Burisma. It was instead something that was bad for Burisma. Burisma liked the fact that there was this corrupt prosecutor. That's the Democratic Party's version of events, and therefore that's the media version's media's version of events as well. Of course, those align. So Devon Archer emerged as a critical witness, and he went to testify before the House Oversight Committee that is investigating all of these business transactions between Joe and Hunter Biden in China and Ukraine and elsewhere. And Devon Archer was asked about Burisma and about this prosecutor. And Daniel Goldman, who has now become, I think, the most popular Democratic member of Congress with the possible exception of Adam Schiff. He's always on cable news on CNN and MSNBC. He's a social media star. They love Dan Goldman. Dan Goldman is the heir to a billionaire fortune, the Levi Strauss fortune. He has spent his entire life in private schools in Manhattan. Exactly the kind of life that you would think that he had. And so, of course, it's natural that the Democratic Party, which is the party of the professional managerial class, reveres somebody who has spent his whole life as a billionaire, just living off the unearned wealth of his dad. And everything about Dan Goldman reeks of that kind of a life in terms of how he speaks, how he conducts himself, the entitlement and arrogance that he oozes from every pore of his body, and just in the way in which he's willing to just blatantly lie. He lies almost as much as Adam Schiff is willing to lie, and just sociopathically. And so, in a lot of ways, Dan Goldman, who also was on the Mueller team, he's just right in the G-spot of Manhattan liberal voters. A billionaire heir to the Levi Strauss fortune, on the Mueller team, constantly going on MSNBC to talk about Donald Trump in collusion with the Russians. It's not difficult to imagine why Daniel Goldman won in Manhattan despite running against many serious and professional politicians, including Mondaire Jones, the African-American congressman who was elected to his first term in 2018, who he defeated, as well as multiple others. He also benefited from the endorsement of the New York Times, run by the Sulzberger boys, who are also billionaire heirs to unearned wealth that they did not earn. And the New York Times endorsement matters nowhere except in the Manhattan district where Dan Goldman is running. You remember hilariously the New York Times in the 2020 Democratic primary campaign co-endorsed Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar. So that shows you the value and the weight of the New York Times endorsement, except in this district where Dan Goldman was running. So the path was paved for him by a combination of his family wealth, being a key part of the Russiagate fraud, and then having his friends, the Sulzbergers, endorse him. Anyway, he went on CNN, specifically with Jake Tapper, to talk about the question of whether Joe Biden intervened in Ukraine to help Burisma while it was paying his son, and in particular, the testimony of Devon Archer, who is being held up by Republicans as proof that Joe Biden was actually corrupt and did in fact intervene. I want you to listen to what Dan Goldman said, because what he said is a blatant, easily proven, and deliberate lie. And once you hear what he says, I'm going to show you the evidence that easily demonstrates that.
And in fact, what we do know is that the only official action the president took related to Hunter Biden's business interests was detrimental to Hunter Biden's company business interest. It was detrimental to Burisma, as Devon Archer, this new star witness for the Republicans, said, because the Burisma had the corrupt prosecutor general, quote, and I quote the witness, under control, and that was a good thing for that prosecutor general to be in office, and yet Joe Biden urged Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, to fire that prosecutor general. That's the only connection that President Biden had with any of Hunter's business dealings.
Okay, so that was a pretty straightforward and easy to understand claim. There's two components to the claim. Number one, when Joe Biden intervened in Ukraine to demand the firing of this Ukrainian prosecutor, it redounded not to the benefit of Burisma, but it prejudiced their business interests because this prosecutor was somebody that Burisma had under control. They didn't want him fired, according to Daniel Goldman. And then the second prong of his claim is what he says is the substantiation of that assertion, which is that Devon Archer testified, said Daniel Goldman, that Burisma had this prosecutor under control. So Dan Goldman went onto CNN and said to Jake Tapper that Devon Archer testified that there was no reason for Burisma to want this prosecutor fired because this prosecutor was under Burisma's control. Now let's look at the transcript of the testimony that Devon Archer gave that Dan Goldman is referencing, where Dan Goldman was present and actually questioning him for part of this testimony. And so he knows what Devon Archer actually said, which is why I say he's deliberately lying. So we're going to put this testimony on the screen, and you see there the key parts which are already highlighted. This is testimony that Devon Archer gave on August 4th. So it's not like there's a time memory lapse issue. We're talking about just a couple of weeks ago. And the question that Devon Archer was asked was the following. Are you aware that Vadim had told Blue Star that one of the issues or pressures that he was facing was related to Shonkin and the investigation into Burisma? And here's what Devon Archer said. Quote, so yes, the narrative that was spun to me, quite frankly, just to be, and I remember this because obviously it's the narrative that was spun to me, was that Shokin was under control. And that whoever the next person that was brought in was, the fact that this is the narrative spun to me, that Shokin being fired was not good because he was like under control as relates to Mykola. I have no way to verify that. And that was spun to me from various folks in DC, not Hunter specifically, but that was what I was led to believe. Whether it's true or not, I cannot speculate. The purpose of what Devon Archer testified to, and he said it 6 times in that one answer, precisely to prevent scumbags like Dan Goldman from twisting and distorting his words, was that the spin that was being created in Washington to justify what Joe Biden was doing, the spin that was given to me, was that having this prosecutor fired was not good for Burisma, but instead was bad for Burisma because Burisma had this prosecutor under control. He even goes so far as to say, I have no way to verify that. And here you see it, just to emphasize the point, how many times Devon Archer tried to prevent Dan Goldman from lying this way. He said, the narrative that was spun to me, again he says, the narrative that was spun to me was that Shonkin was under control. And then he says, this is the narrative that was spun to me. He said it a 3rd time there, that Shonkin being fired was not good because he was like under control as it relates to Mykola. And then again, Devon Archer said, I have no way to verify that. And then for the 4th time, he said, and that was spun to me from various folks in DC. Whether it's true or not, I cannot speculate. Couldn't that be any clearer? Now, when Dan Goldman got to ask Devon Archer a question, he tried to twist his words so that Daniel Goldman could justify going on to CNN and other places like it and lying about what Devon Archer said by claiming, even Devon Archer admitted that the prosecutors being fired was not good for Burisma, was bad for Burisma because they had the prosecutor under control. That's the only way to defend Joe Biden here. And then to be able to say, even Hunter Biden's best friend and business associate, even the star witness of the Republican Party said that Victor Shokin was under control by Burisma, or rather, Victor Shokin, the prosecutor, was under control by Burisma, and therefore firing him was not good for Burisma, would be a pretty significant weapon for the Democrats to use to defend Joe Biden. The problem is, Devon Archer didn't say that. He went out of his way 4 times to say that wasn't what he was saying. And so then Dan Goldman went back and asked, thinking he was a clever lawyer. Remember, he was one of the stars of the Mueller team, the Justice League of the prosecutors that Robert Mueller had assembled, the A-team. And so Dan Goldman tried again. He said, let's talk about legally. I think just to pivot to that, because you had said earlier that, I believe the direct quote is that Burisma felt like they had Shokin under control. Mr. Archer said, correct. And then Dan Goldman said, what did you mean by that? And Devon Archer again went back to say, don't go after this interview and lie about what I'm saying. I'm not saying Burisma had the prosecutor under control, so don't say I'm saying that. He went and again said, that was a narrative that was told to me by various of the DC teams that the firing of Shokin was bad for Burisma because he was under control. Do you see how extreme this is and how deliberate it is? This is the lowest level, most primitive and crude form of lying. It would be like if you were talking to a friend of yours and you were saying, somebody in Washington who is a pathological liar told me that Daniel Goldman is an embezzler, that the way he got wealthy was by stealing people's pensions, and that he has spent his entire life embezzling people's money. I don't believe that. In fact, the person who told me is a pathological liar, and therefore I don't believe that it's true. But that's what this person who I believe is a liar told me, that Daniel Goldman has spent his entire life embezzling and that his wealth is due to theft of pensioners. Imagine if then somebody heard you saying that and went onto television and said that you said, based on that conversation I just described, that Daniel Goldman is an embezzler and that his wealth is based on theft of pensioners' money. That's the same kind of lying that this is. It's that obvious and that primitive. And the reason I can say with a great confidence that Daniel Goldman is lying on purpose, deliberately and intentionally, is because there's simply no way to have sat through this and heard Devon Archer go out of his way multiple times to try and tell Dan Goldman in so many words, do not claim that I'm saying this. Dan Goldman went back to try and get him to say it. And he rejected those words. He refused it. And he said, again, this is the bullshit narrative that was being spun to me in Washington. I'm not saying that. And then Daniel Goldman went on to CNN with Jake Tapper and lied and told the public that Devon Archer said exactly what he repudiated saying multiple times. Now, again, I'm not saying this is the Pentagon Papers or the Snowden reporting or the WikiLeaks reporting. I'm not saying it's on that magnitude of revelation. It's not. But the reason we're nonetheless devoting the first segment of the show to this is because I think it's unbelievable and important to see how casually these people lie. They are complete sociopaths. And the fact that he went on CNN and said that to Jake Tapper, and I'm not even necessarily saying Jake Tapper should have been prepared in that moment to correct him or fact check him, because it's not necessarily the case that you're going to master every nuance of a witness's testimony before an interview. But what I do know for sure, I feel so confident saying, is that CNN is not going to retract that claim. They're not going to go back now and tell their viewers that Daniel Goldman lied. They're never going to confront him about it. They're going to invite him back onto the program. They're never going to mention this. Just like, to this very day, not a single news outlet, including CNN, that spent the weeks in the running up to the 2020 election lying and saying the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation in order to help Joe Biden win the election, even though they now know that's a lie, ever went back and told their audience that either. At some point, when media outlets lie and lie and lie and lie and lie, and it's shown that they're lying, or they allow their guests to lie, and it's shown they're lying, and they never, ever correct the lies. I know it sounds like it's some kind of a sensationalistic claim I'm trying to make, that I'm speaking in order to denounce people, and I'm speaking with kind of maximalist claims. It's not. It's the only rational conclusion you can reach, is that these news outlets lie on purpose. They're there to lie. They're there to validate the liberal proclivities of their viewers. They're there to show their viewers that they're willing to lie for the Democratic Party. That's really what this is about. That's what the willingness to spread the CIA lie about the Russian disinformation about Hunter Biden's laptop was about. It's a way to try and signal to your viewers that you're not a journalist, that you also regard Donald Trump as such a grave threat the way they do, that it's vital that you defend Joe Biden at all costs, even if it means lying. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.